We're going to talk today about consumer campaigning in the 21st century, and because this is essentially a talk that I gave a little while ago, and in order to get a view of where it's going, if you see what I mean, we've done a little snapshot of where it was 24 years ago, and we're doing another little snapshot about it here, and we kind of look at the trajectory and see whether we can kind of extrapolate any patterns from that to see what that would tell us about where we might all be in, 2050 or some far ahead world where we all have learnt how to do it all properly. So, I won't say more about ethical consumer now. Tim's given a bit of an introduction. We're a small research group, got about 10 full-time staff, 10 more, lots of other associates working around the edge of what we do. But this is kind of slightly more theoretical about what consumer campaigning is going on, and these are the kind of the 5 main things that I'm going to talk about. And although this is kind of pitched as food thinkers, what we really are at Ethical Consumer is we look at consumer markets, and food is just one of the consumer markets that we look at. And so, although we are food thinkers, we think about all competitive markets that are supplying consumers, if you like. And so, what I haven't done is I haven't changed these slides to make them all food relevant. And so there are lots of examples of things that aren't food relevant, but there's quite a lot of kind of read across that you can learn from what people are doing in clothing campaigns and and other sectors to kind of understand how similar impacts could happen in food. So we're looking at consumer campaigning. What do we mean by that? Well, let's look at some examples by going to the next slide. So the landscape in 1990, part of what I was talking about, or the point that I was trying to make, is that the kind of mainstream media kind of looks at things like ethical products and Fair Trade Foundation coffee and all this kind of stuff, and it thinks that it's some kind of it understands it in terms of niche markets, or it understands it in terms of fashion that will come and go. But one of the things that we know, if we look back 24 years, is that consumers, if you like, ordinary people in markets, were just as active as they are now, if not more so. So there hasn't really been a kind of growth of awareness. Indeed, people would, there was just as much radicalism and activity going on in markets as there was in 1990 as there is now. But what's happened, the changes that we'll discuss that have happened in between, are the way institutions have started to respond to all this stuff and build really complicated things around it. So just very briefly, these were 4 things that I put up to just to kind of illustrate what was going on there. In 1990, there's some people in the audience who are old enough to remember it, but the South Africa boycott in its day was front page news a lot of the time. There were terrible things going on in South Africa, and people were very keen on being able to take action and do stuff about it. And it's now become a kind of object lesson in how civil society could operate globally at really sophisticated levels and have massive impact on what happened. And effectively, civil society came together and got rid of a government. I mean, it wasn't solely civil society. There was revolutionary activity in the country itself. They were massively important in changing a government. And so it was a kind of, although the campaign was still ongoing at that point, it was a kind of point at which ordinary consumers and their boycotts and their pickets outside shops and their digging up cricket pitches, all this activity that they did, it was a point at which people began to realise that global civil society acting together had real power, really important power. The other things that we could see there are just kind of different examples of things that happened at the same time, that were going on at the same time. There were CFCs in aerosols. That was a fascinating discussion because you can look at different countries around the world, and some of them banned them, and some of them had consumer boycotts, and where everyone took them off the shelves. And it's a kind of useful. It's now seen as a kind of study in how consumer action and regulation kind of operate in the same space and sometimes achieve the same effects, not always. The only food one that we've got here is kind of the idea, we didn't have Fair Trade Foundation in 1990. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But there was the idea of solidarity shopping. There was Nicaraguan coffee. There was a socialist government in Nicaragua that was getting a lot of grief from the United States, and so everyone with a socialist bent in the UK would go and buy Nicaraguan coffee as a way of making a statement, despite the fact that it wasn't a fantastic drinking experience. So we were already seeing, if you like, ethically enhanced products, and there were also other campaign groups operating around different areas. Animal testing is another one there. I mean, that's just to give you a kind of idea of the scope of different activities that people were operating in. If I go back to my first slide, we're going to look at there are key players that have been part of this transition between where we are now in 2014 and where we were then. And that's the head cold. And we're going to look at each of those in turn quite briefly. And pressure groups, if you like, are one of the three key players. And pressure groups is a kind of old academic word sometimes we call it civil society now, sometimes we call it campaign groups or NGOs. But either way, we're using pressure groups, NGOs, for the moment. And I'm taking Greenpeace just as an example. I mean, at Ethical Consumer, as Tim said, we look at different consumer markets. We look at about 4 every 2 months, so we're looking at about 24 a year. And within most consumer markets, there are at least 10 to 50 pressure groups operating around the world. So if we're looking at 24 markets, and we've got if there was 10, there's 240, but we know there's more than that. So there's masses of pressure group activity going on in markets all the time. We haven't obviously got time to look at them all here, but we're just going to look at one pressure group, Greenpeace, very big, everyone knows it, because Greenpeace it's a pressure group that has learned how to operate in markets, how to have maximum impact. Some pressure groups ignore markets altogether, and they see their role as going to the government and saying, you must regulate this thing. It's terrible that there's this stuff in food, or there's this stuff in the way people are treated. You can regulate it. Greenpeace, partly because they operate internationally and it's very hard to regulate internationally, have learnt the art of intervening in markets very effectively. And we've put 4 here because they give, if you like, 4 different pictures on the kind of things that you can do in markets. And the first one is a consumer boycott. There was a boycott of Shell in 1995, which completely took everyone by surprise. And effectively, within 2 weeks, the company had backed down on what it was going to do. The boycott spread quickly across Europe. The company, after saying, don't be ridiculous, we're not going to do that, changed its mind. And the reason it's there is, again, to reiterate the point that was made at the beginning, that no company is too big to be you might look at Nestle or you might look at big food producers and go, there's no way that we can affect that. Look at the size of them. Shell was one of the top 10 companies in the world at that time, and they had to move very quickly because ultimately their sales were falling, down 90% in some outlets in Germany during the course of that boycott, their retail petrol sales. Huge effect. Second one was the green fridge is a fantastic story because it's another way that you can operate in a market. So they observed an oil company doing something they didn't want to do. A boycott happened. They stopped doing it. Another way that you can intervene in markets is by putting your own product in there. You can actually launch a product, and campaign groups can launch products. And to some degree, we'll talk a little bit about Cafe Direct and how that's grown out of campaign groups and this kind of stuff. So NGOs can intervene in markets by putting products in there that show up all the other products around it. Green Freeze Fridge is a good example because Greenpeace complained about the technology in fridges being damaging to ozone layer. They said, look, you can build HFC fridges, you can build fridges with a non-ozone depleting gas. It's really easy. And all the fridge companies said, no, you can't, it'd be ridiculous, can't do that. And so Greenpeace went to a fridge producer in East Germany and said, look, here's our design for a fridge, can you build one for us? And they built one. Sales were so impressive in the first 2 months. Within 6 months, all the fridge manufacturers in Europe had moved to this model of technology. Fantastic effect. I mean, you know, the company in East Germany later went bankrupt and it didn't save it. So it wasn't a good story in terms of you know, building a big market for a small company, but it changed the way that the technology in that market, just by showing that it could be done another way. The other thing that Greenpeace do is that they do rankings of corporate behaviour. They do stuff on electronics, and very famously they rank. It used to be quarterly. People like Philips and or all your big Sony and Nokia, all your phone companies, contemporary technology, and they would put out every quarter a ranking to show how the companies were doing against each other. And that is hugely powerful. This is one of the things that we sort of specialise at Ethical Consumer, and we'll maybe look at a bit more detail at that. But companies, because competition is in their nature, they just get really annoyed at seeing their closest competitors above them, even if it's an ethical ranking. They just can't. They're like kind of, they're like competitive children. Even though it doesn't necessarily make sense to them, they really hate being below them, and they will implement changes in order to move up and down these rankings. And some of the changes are quite profound. I mean, one of the lots of on the electronics companies, Greenpeace introduced an element into the ranking where if the company was lobbying anywhere in the world against climate change regulation, it would lose marks, and it affected the way that companies were operating at a lobbying level. Fantastic stuff. So, and I'm not sure whether it's still ongoing. The last one we put in there is palm oil boycotts. Partly I just dropped it in because it's a food one, and it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. And you know, as we all know, there's a problem with palm oil. I don't have to talk to you guys about it. About the detail of it, and Greenpeace have decided to take palm oil as an issue, and they're going after one company after another. They're choosing big players. I think they took out Unilever first, and then they moved, and essentially they're looking for policy change in their supply chains. They're very sophisticated operators, Greenpeace. They go out to Indonesia where these plants, and they've identified the companies that are doing the most damage, and they're knocking on the door of as it were, Nestle, and they're going, are you supplying from Sinar Mas? This was the company that was particularly in question. And they effectively strangled its supply chain by going to these companies, and they've transformed what is happening there. They're still working at it. There's a Super Bowl thing going out at the moment around PepsiCo and Doritos crisps, I think, happening this week. But it has been fantastically successful, and we can see, they use, when you're a very well-resourced NGO, you can come out with some kind of some quite witty interventions, such as this, as a way of getting your issue across. There's a great video at the moment going out around Doritos crisps and and people eating them, I believe, on palm oil. So we used Greenpeace just as an example of the different ways that an NGO or a campaign group can intervene in markets. It can use boycotts, it can introduce products, it can do rankings, or here it can just target, name and shame particular companies in this way. So, going in the wrong direction. I'll get the hang of this soon. Okay, campaigning companies. Again, this is the next one. I haven't put food companies in here particularly because they just, the ones, it still applies, and we can talk a little bit about food companies particularly. We know these ones. The first three, were quite pertinent at that time. The Cooperative Bank is very well known in the UK for taking a different stance to other banks, and it's recently been through quite a difficult period in its history. And it only released yesterday its new ethical policy, actually, which was quite a relief to lots of people because it hadn't messed up, really. It's been taken over by hedge funds in the States after hitting a bit of trouble. And we've been involved in a big campaign trying to keep it on track. And at the moment, but however, the Cooperative Bank was really interesting in that it took the view that being a company wasn't just about selling product. Actually, you could campaign. And so it was, it worked with Amnesty on campaigns around asylum. It worked, I don't know, did it ever do food stuff? I don't know. But it worked, so it did lots of stuff around arms with Amnesty. It's done stuff. So it's become a campaigner. And in a way, Body Shop was one of the first, Anita Roddick with Body Shop was one of the first companies to realise this. That actually, just because you're a company, it doesn't mean that you can't campaign in the same way that Greenpeace or tell all your people to go and do stuff or this kind of stuff. So we're beginning to during this period, we're kind of beginning to develop this notion that a company doesn't have to just sell stuff, it can do other stuff as well, campaigning. Particularly, Lush is a contemporary example now because it's doing stuff on fracking and climate change, animals, loads of stuff like that. We won't spend a lot of time on it. And I jump to Unilever now, which has got a question mark next to it. It's relevant to food. It's big in the tea sector still. Certainly lots of CSR consultants who we spend time with go, they hold Unilever up as a big multinational corporation that can really change. And I have to say the jury's slightly out in my mind about that. But they say that there's some really quite interesting things going on there. Again, Unilever has been campaigning for climate change regulation and not against it. It's abandoned quarterly reporting because it doesn't believe in too much short-termism. Annual reporting is bad enough. So there's some quite profound changes going on inside it. It's looking at trying to accredit across its ranges and all this kind of stuff. I think lots of people are kind of pretty unconvinced about it. But nevertheless, there's a kind of buzz in the corporate social responsibility world that it's a serious player these days. I'm sure we can exchange some interesting ideas about that one. Small innovators is the other thing that I've put there, and they are very commonly where you find campaigning. A lot of people, particularly in the period since 1990, who are setting up companies, we call them, they're called social entrepreneurs these days and this kind of stuff. People aren't necessarily as fired up as they were making money, and there are masses and masses of people trying to do different stuff with their micro companies. And so they fail as much as any other type of company. But actually, they can change markets, and we can certainly see. Another food product. The coffee market is a really interesting subject for discussion because because originally it was small innovators who moved in there and set up their fair trade accredited coffees, and it was Cafe Direct, which is it's a fantastic organisation that was actually set up by charities, Oxfam, Christian Aid, can't remember who they all were, Twin, wasn't it? This kind of stuff. So, the shareholders were the development charities. They set this up. They were very, very clever about the way that they went about marketing it. And it was so successful that the bigger companies had to look at what was happening. And it drove the Nestlés and the Unilevers towards accreditation because simply they were losing market share. They don't need to even agree with what you do. If they're losing market share, they'll go for it because these corporations seek profits. They know nothing else. So small innovators, and you can look at lots of markets and see how they're doing really interesting stuff. Trading campaigners, I've just stuck that on the end there, and I suppose we're kind of developing this notion that you can be a campaigning trader or a trading campaigner, but the difference between a company and an NGO in a market is becoming a bit more blurred because NGOs can operate in markets and companies can campaign. And at some point, in some really interesting examples, they're beginning to, the identities aren't as clear as they once were. We can go into that a bit more detail. And here's this is a cooperative bank advert about, bullets, in financing arms to repressive regimes and this kind of stuff. And this is just a kind of visual example of what happens when companies start campaigning, is that they have massive reach, really, and they can create quite significant change. Okay. So we've had, let me just go back, remind me what we've had. We've had pressure groups, we've had campaigning companies, and now we're going to third-party accreditors, who are the next key player in this element of change. And three of them are, in fact, I stuck this slide in, and this is just for this one here, and three of them are food and one isn't, and we can talk a little bit about them. And these are really the big change that has happened between 1990 and 2014. It's the arrival of these institutions. I put the FSC at the top because they're one of my favourite ones because they are so complicated. They're democratic, and they have these biannual global gatherings with 600 people all voting and all this kind of stuff. Really kind of complex. Forest Stewardship Council, and it's for labelling sustainable timber. They've got this kind of crazy structure, but they've managed to hold the line, if you see what I mean, really quite effectively between what campaigners want as a minimum before they walk away from the table and what companies want as a minimum before it gets too expensive for them. And they've found this point and really kind of, and it's been hugely successful. I mean, more than 10% of all global timber now is traded FSC. Some in the UK, it's a considerably larger proportion of all traded timber. Another expression that people use for third-party accreditors are multi-stakeholder initiatives, MSIs. And the idea is that they work effectively if they have multi-stakeholders from all the players. And so that they need campaign groups and they need companies. They often have trade unions on there. They will often have. So it's about trying to get everyone who's concerned about change in a particular market to agree a standard that everyone's happy with, and then move towards it. And the next two you'll all be familiar with, the Fair Trade Foundation and the Soil Association, who are quite interesting, particularly when you compare them with each other. In a way, the Soil Association isn't new, and Tim has some great stories about how they go back to pre-war times, and they've got really quite an ancient history. But the Fair Trade Foundation is very new. It's happened since 1990, and it has had an enormous impact. And it's in some markets. We know that, banana markets in the UK now 36% fair trade. In Switzerland, more than 50% fair trade. It's becoming dominant, and they've done this by having a really profound understanding about what consumers are willing to do in markets. We'll maybe have a bit of time to talk a little bit more about understanding what all this means to consumers. But the Fair Trade Foundation has done a lot of work, and it's discovered, and it's kind of discovered what we might know intuitively, that kind of people are pretty, are interested in supporting ethical campaigns, but they're not that interested. They'll pay a little bit more, but they won't pay a lot more. And the detail of where the majority of consumers are is in this kind of area. And the Fair Trade Foundation has very much decided that it wants mass market. And that's what it wants to do. It thinks most change is going to happen in mass market. I mean, you can do fantastic things in your niche corner shop and no one gets trodden on and no compromises are made, but you don't have mass market impact. What Fair Trade Foundation has done is have really massive impact. And it's had to do that by treading, quite a careful line around the impact that its standards has on price. And it's always been tried, I mean, it's complicated, they have fixed price and all this kind of stuff, but it's very aware that if you start making your right-on products more than 10% more expensive than the other ones, you're going to start frightening a lot of people off. And we always use the Soil Association as an example of a different approach to accrediting in markets. And the Soil Association don't give a damn how much it costs. These are the standards, you either meet them or you don't. I mean, I say that, the complexity of different standards in different markets is far more complicated than that. But the Soil Association, and so you can go into a supermarket and your whatever it is, chicken is 4 times as much as your organic chicken is 4 times as much. You wouldn't find the Fair Trade Foundation doing this kind of accreditation because it's very much focused on price. So these are third-party accreditors. But at the Fair Trade Foundation, at the Soil Association, they have, they've got really complicated, I don't know how many staff that I went to the Fair Trade Foundation, they were like huge building, in the same building as Serco or something, and they're huge like corporate operation, floors and floors of people working on this stuff, on accreditation, I lost my string now, but it doesn't matter. We'll move on to the third one, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I put that up there because that's kind of an example of a third-party accreditor that is kind of failing in that it hasn't been able to hold the line between what campaigners want and what companies want, and it's struggled really to make it work. And we can maybe talk in a little bit more detail about that. And the thing about this third-party accreditation, so these huge industries have grown up, and not only are the rooms full of people in the Fair Trade Foundation, there's all the people doing on-the-ground accreditation in the southern countries that are producing. There's the massive industries turning over millions of pounds moving into this space. And one of the things to remember about this space is that it's not uncontested, and I'm going to just put this one up going, not so fair trade, and this is the Fair Trade Foundation getting kicked in The Guardian for accrediting Kit Kat as a Nestle product as a fair trade product. But I mean, to some degree, that's just scratching the surface of the political hostility, if you like, that some of these organisations generate. And to some degree, we talk a little bit about this is now a space where a third-party accreditation is now a space where masses of politics is going on, and actually people lobbying the Fair Trade Foundation for them to make more effective rules. Lots of NGOs are involved in that. Lots of companies are trying to do it the other way. We see other accreditation schemes being launched to try and undermine these ones. It's a political space where masses of activity is going on around trying to address the tendency, if you like, of profit-seeking corporations to always seek profit, and it's trying to create a way for them to not do this by using the latent support that most consumer markets have for values other than profit. So we will move on to the landscape in 2014. I'm not quite sure how we're doing for time. We're kind of on track. So I can't remember whether this is the last one. No, not quite. So we're in 2014. So some markets dominated by ethical products. I've already talked about bananas. We look at tea as an example that we often give at Ethical Consumer. It's very hard to go and buy tea in a shop these days that doesn't have some kind of ethical accreditation for workers' rights on it. It started with fair trade, then Rainforest Foundation, a slightly sub-fair trade standard came in, and we've also got the ethical tea partnership, and so across all of them, pretty much the bulk of the market is accredited as somehow ethical. And so instead of having a market where you kind of go into your supermarket and there are a few little ethical products that are quite expensive in a corner that some people, buy, crazy people with lots of money buy, we've moved to a state where some markets have got a claiming ethical accreditation across the sector. And the next one says some companies are competing on ethics. And this is really interesting. I mean, this is one of the things that, to some degree, we at Ethical Consumer is the kind of holy grail. If you can get competitive behaviours trying to out-ethical other people, then actually campaign groups can step out of the equation and ordinary markets will just sit there and drive up standards. It's quite rare, but you can observe it in places. And to some degree, this is an image for us of what the future might look like. And we use that. This is the slide that we use. And I don't know if people saw this. This is a Sainsbury advert having a go at Tesco's, basically. And Tesco's had this big kind of price competition thing. I can't remember what it was, a few years ago. And I think Sainsbury took them to the Advertising Standards Authority and said they can't say this because we're not selling the same thing. We're adding ethical value. And the ASA, being slightly daft like it is, said, "Oh, foul, what's that? We're not going to rule in your favour." And so, Advertising Standards Authority, sorry. So Sainsbury's went on the offensive and started going, actually, the reason that our price comparisons don't work is because we're doing other things. And Sainsbury's are famously 100% fair trade bananas. And so you can occasionally see this kind of thing going on in markets. So this is, the other one is 5% of consumer spending ethical. One of the things we do at Ethical Consumer is we measure the size of the ethical market, and as I say, the overall ethical spending, about 5% of it, if you add everything up, is a kind of rough idea. Is it 45 billion? A lot of cash, more than alcohol and tobacco? I don't know, there's a lot of stuff going on there. It's quite significant. But then again, it's not 60% of the market. It still looks quite marginal at that point. And also, huge industries around accreditation and CSR, which we haven't touched on, and perhaps we might in the discussion, which is a kind of, CSR is the response, if you like, of companies to all this in various degrees of greenwash or profundity, as you like. So if we kind of go, so this is where we are now. So if we're looking at consumer campaigning in the 21st century, we're kind of looking to see where it might go. I think when people ask ethical consumer, we say that consumer markets probably in the next 20 years will see ethical accreditation across the majority of key products. So I think, and this is because companies have spent a lot of money looking at consumers and what makes them tick and why they're doing this, and they've realised that actually they care a little bit, and they care just enough to make it quite dangerous for companies to ignore this stuff. A lot of them manage it as a risk. They have kind of, they look at the idea that they might wake up one morning and see on the front page of their of the newspaper, Tesco's prawns, whatever it was, it harvested by slave labour on ships. This was something that happened last year, and so they manage this kind of stuff as a business risk. And if you look at how consumer markets, information about how consumers respond to this stuff, it always takes pretty much the same pattern. Whatever country you look in, kind of over time it hasn't changed. 5 to 10% of people are what you'd call the super ethicals, and they will buy ethical stuff even if it's really expensive, quite rubbish. They're really keen on change. They've really switched onto the issues. 10 to 20% at the other end don't care, not interested, don't know what you're talking about, go away, I've got other problems. But then there's this big lump in the middle that is about 60%, 70% of all consumers are actually what we call sometimes ethical. So they're kind of interested in it a bit, but mainly thinking about other things. But it's the fact that it's the majority of the market that is like this, that is meaning that companies are struggling to ignore it, if you see what I mean, and try and pretend that it's not happening. And not engaging with it, and this is why. And actually, if you go to, we had a fascinating. I don't know. Occasionally we meet companies, and we met the kind of European food director of Kraft, who said that she felt coffee was going to be dominant across Europe, would be workers' rights accreditation in the majority of the market by 2020, and this kind of stuff. So big food companies who are doing long-term visioning see this coming too, and so are engaging with it in various degrees of sincerity. We will. Sorry. Well, this is the last slide where we'll finish. And this is just a way about. This is just kind of reflecting on. Are we really seeing cultural change here about how people react to markets? And I'm kind of asking the question. This is, to some degree, the UK is ahead on a lot of this stuff, but not exclusively. Different cultures are on different stuff. Germany and its environmental purchasing is considerably more advanced. And they take, so there's a range of different of cultural differences, but to some degree, lots of this stuff is more developed in the UK. Direction of travel is something that I talked about right at the beginning. Are we looking at a future where we're seeing lots of ethical, in inverted commas, accreditation in markets? Are we seeing NGOs and campaign groups campaigning more in markets than they were before, and are we looking at, are we going to turn on our TVs in 20 years' time and see, I don't know, Procter and Gamble going, look how well we, or Apple saying, look how well we pay our workers in China these days, and I don't know, in a competition with Samsung. Is this the future? Are we going to see this? And I don't know. To some degree, some degree the answer lies with us and what we do. We are that market, we are those campaigners, and we can walk away from this or we can engage with it. So just a couple of little kind of maybe kind of discussion items to throw in there. are lots of people, or I don't know, lots of people. It's been lots of this activity in markets by NGOs and civil society to try and make change has been put down to the fact that regulation in global markets is bloody complicated and it's really hard to get, and it takes you years and years to get agreement internationally. Let's say you see, I don't know, you see that, we don't like labour conditions in the, I don't know, fresh produce industry in Africa. How do we deal with that? And there are, we can either we can have regulation, and that's fantastic, but we can also have consumer intervention, and they can operate to some degree in the same space. That's not to say, regulation is almost certainly better every time, but it just takes a long time to get there, and I think lots of people, like ourselves at Ethical Consumer, are too impatient to wait for it, because we think you can drive change in markets at the same time. So, reaction to democratic deficit, regulation. So some people are talking about civil society regulators, or civil society as some kind of regulator operating in this sector by trying to engage consumers around, and so effectively if fair trade or the Rainforest Alliance are some kind of workers' rights, they're looking to regulate out worst elements of child labour and all this kind of stuff. They've got factory inspectors, they've got all the stuff that you would see in a normal regulatory system. What we're seeing is kind of civil society regulation. So there's a bit of an academic theme, kind of rambling off down exploring those ideas. Reaction to democratic deficit. I mean, that's other people have seen consumers acting in markets to be, to some degree, addressing some of the issues that we see that, we've got an election, people are talking about how it's all rubbish and we're all choosing from people that are the same and all this kind of stuff. So you vote in elections once every 5 years, you're not getting any impact, but how consumers operate in markets allows them, if they're taking political or social issues into account, or to act politically on a far more frequent basis. And so the final point, I think it is the last slide. So the final point is it cultural change that we're seeing? That means ordinary consumers are kind of learning that acting in markets involves, or can involve, taking social, environmental, ethical, political issues into account. This is normal, this is fine, this is how the world works. And to some degree, certainly a few years ago, we could see, citizenship education in the UK, and buying fair trade was one of the things that kids would learn about as part of citizenship education. Slightly eroded now. But we see little elements of this appearing in formal educational stuff. So this is perhaps the culture of the future, where we all know about that stuff. So just before, just before I finish, I'm going to just need to kind of just remind us why we're doing this. And it's because we are profoundly concerned about what happens when profit-seeking corporations act untrammeled in markets around the world, both food and other markets, and they cause enormous problems. As I was saying earlier in the Food Bites film, they treat the environment, they treat human rights, they treat animals and all this kind of stuff as externalities to some degree. And if you maximise the care that you take on these, you maximise your profits. If you minimise the attention you put on them, you can maximise profit. And to some degree, markets can operate to drive those standards down. If consumers are just walking into a shop and buying on price without being aware of this stuff, they can be acting to make stuff worse. Ordinary competition, if you're not doing stuff with it, is going to make stuff worse. And so, and the and the actions of these, and to some degree, one of the main narratives of the last 20 years has been about how corporate power has moved, to dominate lots of markets, food markets, getting bigger and bigger companies. We're seeing monopolies develop, and they're rapacious and they're horrible and they're doing terrible things. And I think the thing that the ethical consumer is bringing to the discussion is that that's not the whole story. And there is a powerful counter-narrative which is of NGOs operating in markets using the kind of latent concern that the bulk of consumers have in order to challenge corporate power on this level. And there are, there's lots of debate if you look inside it about what, are we really just kind of making them do CSR? Is this change kind of profound enough? What kind of world are we going to have in the future? And I think at best, one of the things, the most radical edge of consumers is what they're doing is that they're rebuilding markets without profit-seeking companies in them. And a future that we might be able to see is, I don't know, a coffee, a food market, say a coffee market, where there are in fact no profit-seeking corporations in there at all. We could have a range of different organisations. The cooperative is interesting because it's not profit-seeking in the normal way. We could have campaign groups in there with their own products. There's still competition going on in there, but actually we could create whole markets without corporations in them. And you can see it. It takes a long time. It takes 20 years, 25 years, but you can see it happening. And that, if you like, is a vision of a sustainable future that we try and entertain in our more optimistic moments. So I think that's a good place to stop. There's probably a few questions, I imagine, and challenging things to say.
Thank you. Stephanie, Pesticide Action Network. Is this working?
Yeah, it's just recording rather than boosting the sound.
Thanks, Rob. That was really, really helpful. Obviously, my field is pesticides. I was interested in the stuff you were talking about, the accreditation standards. I mean, we've done work with several of them. We've also done work with some of the big corporates like Unilever as well. And certainly I think the sustainability standards, I am quite impressed by how far they've managed to help farmers move away from using specific hazardous pesticides. We did some work on looking at coffee last year with farmers in Latin America. So I think that's really good. But a lot of you mentioned the huge industry that's been set up around accrediting and going and auditing. And I also sort of feel there's a huge amount of data, but that system doesn't seem to lead to lesson learning very much. Certainly on the kind of things that we're looking at, use of water, soil, pesticide reduction, those kind of things. It's a bit like the CAP for European farmers, all the data that gets sucked out of farms but never repackaged in a form that's useful for them. This is kind of a question for Tim as well in terms of cities' academic interest. But do you see any option for making those standards more lesson learning, sharing experiences, given the competitivity that there is between some of them as well?
I mean,
you need to remind us, are you wired up?
I am, yeah. I've got my own microphone. There are lots of issues around those, and I know there are some, there's some very genuine concerns that they become self-sustaining institutions of their own, whose main purpose is now to preserve the jobs of all the people on them, and the kind of vision for change that was once there has kind of disappeared, and so there's quite a lot of really quite pertinent debate around that, and I think I mean, Ethical Consumer are planning to hold a conference later in this year, trying to get accreditation standards together and just share some information about how they do accreditation and, you know, what works and what doesn't. And I guess to some degree, that doesn't happen a lot, and that's the reason why we're doing it. We haven't seen a lot of that happening. I mean, I think, you know, it happens at, you know, food conferences. I've been to food conference where Tim is, and you find Soil Association and Fair Trade Foundation in the same room, and we'll exchange stuff. But as a no, there's no kind of formal mechanism for them to do that, and, you know, maybe it's something we can do at Ethical Consumer. I don't know.
Do you want to pass the microphone back? Can you say who you are, sir?
Hi, I'm Katerina. I'm working for Portland Communications. Portland Communications.
Okay.
Yeah. Portland. It's a PR company.
Okay.
I too have got a cold with nothing here.
I have. So I think everyone.
Does anyone not? There's only three. The majority.
Yeah, Tim,
There's an outbreak of flu as well. I've got you.
Yeah. Oh, have you?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if those big corporations acting in those increasingly ethical markets, if they want to kind of address these issues, what are the things they could do? Are there kind of partnerships with NGOs and with those campaigning groups where they can work together? And or is it just they themselves plan it separately and the campaigning groups are just pushing for things?
I mean, it's an ecosystem, if you like, and there's a huge variety of people finding different niches in there.
Yeah.
And, you know, some corporates operate inside these systems with great cynicism and do the minimum that they can. Others have, you know, others have managers in there who are genuinely kind of taken with the whole debate and are trying to do change. You know, and, you know, are therefore trying to set up partnerships within it. I mean, we've done quite a lot of detailed work on bananas with Fair Trade Foundation in the last couple of years, and there are quite a lot of separate initiatives going on between partners with it in the accreditation, between, you know, NGOs and companies all involved in the broader initiative, trying to do extra standards, you know, because they see the base standard as perhaps not doing as much as it could, and they try and achieve additional stuff.
So is that what ethical consumer battles have become? Is it a battle about how high those standards are?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree. I mean, this is where, you know, it's quite an esoteric debate, and it's hard to, you can't really get the majority of, it isn't a debate that happens necessarily in the public domain a great deal. But there's masses of stuff going on there, and I guess that's sort of stuff that we write about.
I thought it was one of the most interesting things, well, there was a lot that was really interesting what Rob said for me, but that contrast of 25 years, 1989, mass demonstrations on the streets about South Africa, has it become a battle over standards, which is done in boardrooms between NGOs and, what's it, where is the popularising? Popularisation has gone to Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah.
So the campaigning has changed.
Yep.
Another question.
Isa Kruszewska from Greenpeace. I've done quite a lot of market campaigning in my time, including the electronics ranking.
Oh, yeah.
But I would say we can't do it all with market campaigning. I think there's a real danger that if we don't cement those gains that we get through market campaigning, you'll get backsliding. And we've certainly seen that in the electronics work on PVC, for example. If you're not watching these companies constantly, I don't think you're going to maintain those gains. Maybe with agriculture, it's a bit different to electronics in that, you know, once you've changed the production system, you're not going to change it back overnight. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that, you know, the interplay between the political system and consumer market work campaigning.
No, I mean, you know, it's what's the price of freedom is constant vigilance or something. I don't know. I mean, you know, ultimately, without that vigilance, that is going to happen, I think. And I don't, you know, and to some degree, regulation can cement it. And you know,
where are examples? Can I put Eva's question in a different way? Are there examples of where I'm trying to think as I'm asking this question. Are there examples in food where a standard is raised and then has got weaker? Stephanie, on pesticides, things have got worse? Not really.
The issue there is more. Yeah, I'm sorry, we have another Greenpeacer here. Greenpeace International.
So I should have asked if there was anyone from Grip before I put a slide up and started telling you.
It's okay.
Oh, okay. No, wait till you've got the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a certain amount of reaction from, for example, from the pesticide producers. Whatever's targeted, they'll come up with a different kind of pesticide, a lighter, supposedly greener, etc., etc. And what they're not interested in is investing in the alternatives. Except now you do see Syngenta seriously going into bio pest control. They're breeding insects, they're breeding all kinds of bacteria and fungus and all this kind of stuff. So, and pest predators. So there is to some extent a reaction, but it tends to be a sideways step. That's my experience a lot of the time. But I had another question, but I'll let you finish this discussion first. So you talked about once companies compete on ethics, campaign groups can step out and markets will drive it. How many cases do we have of this? And in what areas? I mean, is it food, electronics, clothing?
I mean, I'd say the evidence is thin. I mean, it's as much theoretical as it is real. I think we do. I mean, we have. At Ethical Consumer, we have this notion of mature ethical markets and immature ethical markets, and coffee is a classic example of a mature ethical market. People have been campaigning on it for 25 years. There's loads of accreditation standards existing in that space, and you can go to other things like golf clubs or something, and no one's really kind of asked ethical issues about the production of golf clubs. Golf balls, I think they have, but not clubs. Anyway, and so and that we describe that as an immature ethical market. So in mature ethical markets, there is evidence of competition on ethical standards, and it's particularly amongst those that are most ethical, if you see what I mean. And so in supermarkets is interesting because it's big and it's very significant in food. And I think we have seen real competition, particularly between the Co-op Group and M&S. There was a period during which they were genuinely trying to outdo each other around ethical standards. I mean, I have to say, sadly, that's slightly fallen by the wayside since the Co-op hit its financial troubles of the last couple of years. But we very much hope that we could see that again. Again, we see a little bit around of it around Tesco's, and Sainsbury's in this case as well. So we saw there's evidence of a little bit of that going on there, and in other mature ethical markets. Maybe I don't know about electronics. I mean, to some degree, a little bit of it. There was a lot of stuff in the footwear sector, after the big Nike boycott of the 1990s, and
what about the baby food market?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Baby food market. Anyone here following the baby food market? It's the obvious one in my mind.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm quite new to the baby food market, but I have, over the last couple of weeks, looked into it. And it's my understanding that the breast milk code is something that has existed for 20 years, and there have been a number of different revisions to it, and yet compliance is still fudged. Companies dispute what the law says, what the regulation says. Compliance isn't very well tracked, so the data might not necessarily be there for civil society to take the companies to task. There are indexes, for example, FTSE for Good. I believe they don't use the breast milk code because no food company or breast milk producer would be on the FTSE for Good if they use the code. So you've got an example there where the ethical consumption is possibly at a lower bar than the law itself.
I didn't ask you where you're from.
I'm from Save the Children.
I think the baby food market is an interesting one, and you at Ethical Consumer have done some reports on baby food and breast milk substitutes, two
Yeah.
very different markets. But this is probably one of the longer standing areas in where there have been ethical fights with big food companies. Indeed, for those who are interested in this, come to Hannah Brinston's Food Thinkers when she does it, because she's been reviewing some of that data. I mean, it's really one of the greatest campaigns from civil society ever in the world of food, is the anti-Nestle and the baby food area. But at the same time, Nestle's world market share of food has grown inexorably. So on the one hand, it's a very effective campaign. On the other hand, Nestle has grown. So it's kind of something I want to flag with you. I want us to talk before we end this about what do we mean by effective? What do you mean by effective campaigning? What's a good campaign? But the lady, did you want to come back in?
Hi, my name is Cara Lever from Free Range Dairy Network. We're trying to set up a community interest company as a sort of a dairy farmers movement, and we are looking to have, we have got a trademark label we want to use that will be independently audited, which will be accredited to farmers that meet criteria, which is that the farmers will be paid a fair price for their milk in the UK, the cows will be grazed for a minimum of 6 months, and it'll be a better product. And for now, we are working with independent auditors, and we're also working with academics on this. But for now, really, we want the label to be something which is a bit of a shorthand for consumers, because at present, there's just a kind of, there's organic or there's sort of generic milk, which doesn't actually show how the cows are being kept or how the milk is being produced or even what the farmers are really being paid. So it's, I suppose it could be a shorthand of a sort of a fair trade for UK. And so I'm just answering to the woman who asked the question. I mean, we do want to share this with people, but for now, it really is about getting a label out there that consumers can vote for, in a sense, by buying that product. And I suppose in some ways also, is that the role that maybe labels play now if people aren't boycotting products like or companies in the same way that they used to?
I think that's a very good question.
I mean, there's a quick answer because there's lots of questions. I mean, to some degree, among many things we do at Ethical Consumers, track boycott behaviours, and and it seems actually like boycott behaviours are kind of about as active as they ever were, actually. But lots of them are quite, they're not necessarily organised boycotts. People are doing them without being told that they're part of a campaign. Last year we did a survey. Is it 40% of people were boycotting Starbucks because of tax avoidance? No one had actually called a boycott or was organising one, but it was massive. And Starbucks had really big hit on its...
How big was it?
Big enough for them to be quite scared, I think. And we've just started research on the coffee market, and I think their market share has gone down quite considerably from what it was. I mean, we are doing. I don't know what the answer is to that. So I mean, so what third-party accreditation does? No one trusts companies. They're profit-seeking. No one likes them, and so they need a third party that they trust, which is the NGO sector, to do it. And they're great because you don't need permission to do it. You can set it up. It can either fly or it can't. Often they're competitive, a bit like products. And we've had I think there are 423 consumer ethical labels around the world at the moment, and you can see there's a lot of something like that. There's a great website that's got them all. I maybe get it up one, there's talk about consumer confusion but I think ultimately we don't buy that. I mean, we think if it's good and it's got confidence, it'll rise to the top in the way, and some of them have failed just because they aren't very good products. And so we think that's kind of healthy in a way.
Okay.
Tom, I'm on the master's program, Tim's master's program. I wondered what your answer would be to this question of affordability, because you said Soil Association didn't care about the price of organic food, but actually they really do care about accusations of elitism, which so I wonder how important affordability is for ethical consumer markets.
It's critical, and I think lots of people misunderstand ethical markets by thinking that somehow you can look at them in any realistic way without looking at price too. I think that's probably the most misunderstood thing that we come across. And so when consumers buy stuff, they buy primarily on price. And the second thing that they take account of is quality. The third thing that they take account of is ethics. Almost across markets, across cultures, it's entire. So, and I think lots of people have got in a muddle by kind of thinking, oh, ethical consumers is a great movement of people who don't care about price, and it's not. It's people who care about price, but they're not willing to accept rubbish standards around social environmental stuff too. And I think you can do that, but you have to make sure that that's a clear element of the conversation, really. And lots of green and ethical products have failed because they've misunderstood that, and actually, people are always going to be looking at price. No, even if you're not poor.
You've done work on the social class and ethical markets.
Yep, there's stuff on the website, but I.
Let's give you a moment to go around the website in a moment. Let's just take. We've got 2 more questions.
You were there as well, weren't you, on the front?
Oh, 3 more questions.
I've got 2 very quick questions on the accreditation schemes.
Again, who you are.
Francis from Save the Children. But first of all, what evidence is there that of crowding out in accreditation schemes? For example, when you get competition between Fair Trade Foundation and Rainforest Alliance, do consumers get confused and perhaps not buy the products that are labelled? And secondly, do you believe that certification is suitable path to kind of realise ethical consumption? For example, when you have the fair trade certification of sugar. I seem to remember Tim Lang a long time ago making an argument that sugar is a waste of agricultural land and has a tendency to leave people with diabetes. So, I don't know, is it ethical to start branding products that could be harmful as ethical?
Good question. Can Tate and Lyle's sugar be ethical? It says it is, and so does the Fair Trade Foundation.
Yes, I know. I do fair trade cigarettes, tobacco. There are some, there's some classic
eco-friendly armaments.
Indeed, these have all been floated. You wouldn't believe it, but they have. And ultimately, it's a political choice, isn't it, for the organisations involved as to whether the risk is
eco-friendly bullets.
No, it's.
What about the crowding out business?
I think the reason that they're successful is that people genuinely want assurance that they're not buying a product with child labour or whatever it is that the issue is in the market that they're in. So if they trust the assurance and the assurance looks okay, then I'm kind of less concerned about the crowding out, if you see what I mean. They're unlikely to trust it if they don't have NGOs on board anyway. So there are very few accreditation schemes that are just company oriented that have any weight at all. In fact, I'm struggling to think of any. So I don't think there's a danger of crowding out, and the only way that one might become more successful is because it's more effective. I mean, there's complexity in there, but I think that's the dominant pattern.
One could become more effective if it was easier to comply to. For example, if a company trading coffee found it easier to meet a standard as opposed to a gold standard, then I guess you might get a race to the bottom, even in ethical accreditation.
Yeah, and I mean, we, and that's, it's part of the job of the Fair Trade Foundation to kind of explain why its standards are better, like any product, if you like. It's a product, you've got to go why yours is better than the other one. And ultimately, I think, no, I mean, they can do it. I mean, I think I'm not unduly concerned.
Yeah, my name is Kate. I'm from RSPB. I work in our international division, our little-known international end, and particularly in West Africa. And what I'm interested in is If you have consumer pressure in, say, Ghana, which has quite a large range of ethical commodities, driving better land use in, that and other countries, but being driven from here, if the UK is a really big ethical consumer market, do you know anything about ethical consumer markets elsewhere? So are there ethical consumer markets in Ghana? Because that's what I'd really love to see, is not us driving this, but them driving this. But I don't know if there's much evidence of that.
I don't know much about Ghana. I mean, we know stuff about ethical consumer markets elsewhere. South Africa is a really interesting example, where there is lots of interest in ethical markets. And
ethical trade initiative in Ghana?
Yeah. I mean, Divine Cocoa comes out of Ghana, doesn't it? So,
ethical trade initiative?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
You should do that.
So,
definitely that's your first step.
But about consumers in southern countries, there's done some. I mean, so Africa's a really interesting example because you can get fair trade products from Africa, but there's also a market with African people to buy fair trade products, and you can't do that in the UK. You can't buy homegrown fair trade products because it doesn't work because it's about export. So we're beginning to see fair trade markets in the south for their own products that aren't imported, if you see what I mean. Same in Chile. There's a growing market for fair trade in Chile, which also has a lot of accreditation. So there was one of the studies that we put out last year was when we put out, we reported someone else had done the damn study, was of interest in ethical consumer behaviours in Brazil and China and basically BRIC countries. And you saw that the same level, exactly the same patterns that you saw, 10% really interested, 30% not interested, but the majority of people actually quite interested in ethical products across the world. And that's really exciting. If you see it in China, you go, hey, that'd be quite fun. You could do stuff there.
I have a completely different topic, which has a lot to do with your future vision, but I just add that Chatham House just did a report on meat consumption attitudes, and they identified the South as the countries with the most flexibility and openness to changing their consumption patterns. It's a very specific issue, but I'm pretty sure you'd find the same trend in other areas, funnily enough. So that's an interesting area maybe to be studied. I'm interested in the radical edge consumerism vision, not surprisingly maybe. Which groups and organizations, accreditation, otherwise, are already engaged in this, other than, for example, Transition Town, possible existing cooperatives, Mondragon, anywhere? This vision, of course, it can be a completely theoretical one, but I suspect it maybe has some experiential or practical links as well. Is there anything that's really happening on this? As a whole system change, not just as these are all the elements they could be put together, but is there anyone really pushing for this system change?
I think the answer is probably yes, and then you're going to ask me who, and I'm not certain, what. I mean, there's masses of stuff going on. There's lots of kind of local initiatives around local supply chains, particularly around food. Really interesting stuff going on there. And we have one lot in Manchester who we work closely with, who are developing really interesting models, completely different models without profit-seeking companies anywhere in them, and supply chains that are completely independent. And ultimately, I understand that there's some studies going to be produced next year about. We did a little bit 2 years ago ourselves on cooperatives. What would happen if cooperatives kind of grew to outcompete private corporations across the world? And are the markets where we can see that happening? What if they could be, if they were a more sustainable structure and better done? So we've done a little bit of work around cooperatives ourselves. There's another book coming out.
Are you aware of Zero Carbon Britain study? That's one of the most interesting. If you're interested in Zero Carbon Britain 2.
This is the Centre for Alternative Technology
Centre for
thing.
Alternative Technology, yeah. That's a very sort of far-sighted one. But that's not what you're meaning. Okay, good.
John Whiting, a food writer. You mentioned the great difficulties in getting international legislation through. But there have been some remarkably successful efforts at the national level, individually, around the world, third world countries and first world countries do it. There is now about to go through almost certainly the Atlantic and the Pacific trade agreements, which are going to set up an international court in which corporations can sue individual countries for the profits which they lose as a result of putting through ethical legislation. What do you think is the prognosis?
Well, I don't know. I mean, people who've followed what 38 Degrees are doing on that, and it was announced last week that the consultation at European level had 97% of people said that, and it was announced earlier this week that that element of TTIP has been parked. Now, whether I think lots of us don't actually believe that for a moment, but I think, we saw really significant civil society action against WTO and GATT, as it were, in the late 90s, when people actually hit
1987 to 1994.
There you go, Tim. Tim will be as an authority on the subject. But there was rioting in the streets around that. People were not going to take that stuff lying down, and it's interesting to see whether this time around people will be able to do it all with internet campaigning. I don't know, or whether whether people will hit the streets again. But I'm certain that they will. People are not foolish. They can see what's coming, I think, and the opportunity to share knowledge and to act quickly is far better than it ever was. I'm quite optimistic.
Well, NAFTA went through and it's quietly doing its damage. NAFTA went through and it's quietly doing its damage still.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No.
Forgive me, I was wrong. The GATT was negotiated 87 to 94, but you're talking about the Seattle coming to a head. That was 1999.
Yeah.